Hello again, boys and girls. Well, welcome to chapter 3 in our book, The Mr. Mousey Beyond the Silver Sea Adventure. I hope you enjoyed the first 2 chapters. You remember we left off, where was it? Oh yes, they had just discovered that the book was leading them on an adventure. Mr. Mousey was very excited about that, but Mr. Rabbit less so. So let's get straight in to chapter 3, the beginning. Even after Billy had left, Mr. Rabbit was still thinking of perfectly good reasons why going across the river just wasn't any part of any adventure he felt like being a part of. For another thing, he said, I can't swim. Even if I did agree to go with you, how would I ever cross the river without drowning? Did you know drowning can be dangerous? Well, Mr. Mousey was sitting looking into the fire. He often did this when he was considering something important. There's a way across the river that involves nothing more than wet feet, you know. And besides, this is more than just an adventure, Mr. Rabbit. You see that, don't you? Replied Mr. Mousey seriously. Well, if you mean getting eaten by some wild beast that lives in the wild land or starving to death miles from home is more than an adventure, yes, you're probably right. Now, Mr. Rabbit, if I didn't know better, I'd say you sounded like you were afraid. Although, I know that couldn't be true, Mr. Mousey said, looking up at his friend. Who says it isn't true? Asked the rabbit. Sure doesn't everyone know that you are the brave Mr. Rabbit? Besides, he continued, this isn't simply an adventure. This is a rescue. A rescue? Who said anything about a rescue? Mr. Mousey turned towards the book that now lay open at chapter 2, with the picture of the two of them and the tree. The way to the adventure ahead, the mission of rescue, he read aloud and turned again to his friend. A rescue, Mr. Rabbit. Someone, somewhere, is in danger and we are being called. Someone needs us. Well, this put a whole different view on the thing. It was one thing not being willing to stick your neck out for no good reason, but Mr. Rabbit was like his pal in this. If someone needed help, you never refused. But are you saying this book is based on something real? Don't you think it might be just a story with us as heroes? I believe, said Mr. Mousey, sitting down and looking once again into the fire, that this is some kind of magical book that carries a cry for help. I may or I may not be right, but there is only one way to find out. What's that? Asked Mr. Rabbit, who was very hopeful that the answer may not. We must find the tree in the picture and find what it is that we're looking at. If it turns out the tree doesn't exist, then we come home and all is as before, replied the thoughtful mouse. Mr. Rabbit considered this before answering. But what if we find the tree? He put forward. Well, then we look in to see if there's anything in the trunk. If not again, we make our way home, shrugged Mr. Mousey. Mr. Rabbit liked the way Mr. Mousey kept on coming up with situations where they would simply come home. But, he said, thinking a little further ahead, not an easy thing for Mr. Rabbit, what if there is something in there? Mr. Mousey paused before replying, well, that would depend on what we find, I suppose. Mr. Rabbit was feeling better by the minute. So if we only find twigs and grass, we can come home. Yes, I should imagine so. And if we only find an old dead bird or an empty plastic bag, we also come home. Yes, nodded his friend. I think we'd need to find something more remarkable than that before we'd embark on a dangerous adventure. Mr. Rabbit wasn't finished yet. What about an old sock? We'd come home for an old sock, wouldn't we? Mr. Mousey looked up and tried not to laugh at his friend's serious face. Yes, Mr. Rabbit, he smiled, for an old sock, for a lollipop stick, for a mouldy tea bag, for a sleeping slug, and even a half-chewed carrot, we'll come home. Mr. Rabbit still had his brainy thinking face on. What if it's only a bit chewed? It was too much for Mr. Mousey. He laughed out loud and grabbed his best friend by his arm. Don't worry, chum. We'll know when we get there whether or not we'll come back. We'll just know. Later on, before darkness fell, Mr. Rabbit headed back to his own home to prepare for the morning and get some sleep. They had arranged to meet again at Mr. Mousey's house in mid-morning. This gave them time to get things sorted out in their homes before leaving. Neither of them had any idea how long they'd be away. It might only be a day, or it might be a week. Mr. Rabbit hoped they would be back later that afternoon. It was just as well. Neither he nor Mr. Mousey had any idea of what actually lay ahead. After his friend had left, Mr. Mousey tidied up the kitchen and began to pack. He fetched his backpack from below his bed and started to put in a few basic things he might need. Let's see, he wondered to himself. What will I need for a couple of days in the open? Mr. Mousey was thinking in terms of at most 3 nights away from home, so he began to pack accordingly. He put in his sleeping bag, a waterproof coat, a compass and a knife. A magnifying glass as well, you just never know. And after a few minutes in the kitchen, a fair-sized bag of sandwiches, biscuits and as much other food as would fit in. Mr. Mousey himself could get by on fairly little food, but he knew Mr. Rabbit too well. Now, that's just about everything, he said to himself. Time to call it a night. As he turned to head to the bedroom, he caught sight of the book lying closed on the table. He wondered now if it would be an idea to pack it along with everything else, although something in the back of his head seemed to recommend this. The sheer size of it demanded that it be left behind. Mind you, can't just leave it lying around, he thought out aloud. After a quick look around, he set the book into the top drawer of his writing desk. He had to move a few things out first, for it took up the whole space. There you go, safe as houses. Still, a little nagging doubt jiggled about in his head, and, well, he hoped it would just jiggle off and let him get on with things. As far as getting ready was concerned, that was all about either he or Mr. Rabbit prepared. Small woodland creatures can manage considerably better than us out in the open countryside. Mr. Mousey slept pretty well. Mr. Rabbit, however, tossed and turned all night, dreaming dreams that included all kinds of frightening creatures attacking him, falling off cliffs, and quite a bit of never quite having enough to eat. It was hard to say which part of these dreams troubled him the most, to be honest. In the morning, Mr. Mousey was just about to head over to the rabbit's house when he heard his knock at the door. I was beginning to think you weren't coming, said Mr. Mousey to himself as he greeted him in the doorway. Mr. Rabbit looked a bit strained and a little bit out of breath. "Oh, it took me longer to get here than I thought," he puffed. "Have you put your house higher up the hill or something?" Mr. Mousey took one look at the enormous pack on Mr. Rabbit's back and whistled. "Wow, Mr. Rabbit, have you got everything from your house in there?" Mr. Rabbit looked upward and thought, "No, I didn't bring any furniture." "Actually, I was joking," replied the mouse, "but what have you got in there?" "Do you mind if I just sit down for a bit?" wheezed Mr. Rabbit. "Only if I don't, this pack will anyway." Tottering alarmingly, Mr. Rabbit struggled in through the doorway. It was quite a squeeze. With an almighty whoomph, he landed on the sofa, or he would have if he hadn't missed it, and whoomphed onto the floor instead. There he lay, like an upturned snail with one mighty big shell. "You wouldn't just lend a hand, would you, Mr. Mousey, would you?" grunted Mr. Rabbit from his unusual position. Mr. Mousey actually had to partially clamber up the monstrous backpack to release the straps from under the rabbit's shoulders. With a click, he undid the hip buckle and Mr. Rabbit promptly fell onto the floor. "Ouch!" he cried, landing on his nose. "Thanks." "Can I ask a smallish question?" asked Mr. Mousey. "Yes, please," said a frazzled-looking Mr. Rabbit. "And a bun too would be nice." "Well, I wasn't actually going to ask if you wanted a cup of tea. I just wondered if you had any idea how far you thought we were going to walk today." Mr. Rabbit looked accusingly at the vastly overfed backpack. Well, to be honest, I hadn't really given it a great deal of thought," he muttered. I was rather busy thinking about packing." "What have you packed? You do know I have my own pack, don't you?" "Well, I should hope so," replied the rabbit. "I've only really packed enough food for me." And what else?" "Else? You mean to say that all you have in that massive pack is food? Nothing else?" "Well, I couldn't really think of anything else I would need as it happens." Mr. Mousey shook his head. "Come on, let's lighten it. We're already late, and if we set off with that, we may as well just give up now." "Well, since we're talking about giving up, let's just..." "But we're not. So come on, you rabbit, you." It took about half an hour, but after quite a bit of persuasion, Mr. Rabbit left behind the better half of the contents of his pack, and they were standing in Mr. Mousey's garden path. "I still think I shouldn't have left out the potatoes," complained Mr. Rabbit. "They were going to be chips, you know." "Fried in what?" asked Mr. Mousey. "Come on, the road lies before adventure and the mission of mystery." Muttered the rabbit half under his breath. "Go look at a tree, get wet and cold, come home, some mission." The sun was shining, and the late morning sun was beginning to bring a real warmth to the day as the two friends left the hillside and made their way down towards the river. The path to the woods lay alongside the river bank, and it was Mr. Mousey's intention to cross the river further upstream, where the river was considerably narrower and much less deep. Across the river was the wild land, where their journey actually lay, but there was no chance of crossing a river at this point. As they walked upstream, Mr. Mousey gazed across at the far bank. Neither he nor Mr. Rabbit had ever been to the other side, and although Owl had flown over it he never really talked about it. He never really talked about what was there, what he had seen. His mind was usually on other things altogether. Mrs. Crow once talked about flying over a harder, rougher land than the soft and gentle woods, but she had never landed to take a closer look. The river flowed gently by as they made their way. The path was well worn, used as it was by most of the woodland creatures on a daily basis. It was the main route to and from the meadows, and hardly a day went by without Mr. Mousey and Mr. Rabbit meeting friends on its winding trail. As they turned a corner, they heard a call and looked up to see Sammy Squirrel scampering towards them. "Hi guys," he called out as he approached. "Are you only leaving now?" But the mouse and the rabbit looked at Sammy, surprised that he seemed to have some knowledge of their journey. "Oh," said Sammy, seeing their surprise, "Billy told us last night that you were going on an adventure." He was grinning madly as he spoke. "I've been hoping I might see you before you go. Good luck." "Boy, Mr. Rabbit, you're so lucky. I wish I was going." "You wouldn't think I was so lucky if you had to carry this ton weight," puffed Mr. Rabbit. "See how wishy-wanty you would be then." "What have you got in there, Mr. Rabbit?" exclaimed the squirrel. "A dead body?" "No, that's what I will be if I ever come back." Sammy laughed and slapped the rabbit on his back, or as near to his back as he could get because of the enormous backpack in the way. "Good old Mr. Rabbit, brave to the end. Enough of this talk about end and all that stuff about dead bodies," said Mr. Rabbit, who was also getting a bit tired of the brave word too, to be honest. "Do you know if Owl is up this morning?" Mr. Mousey asked Sammy. "Oh yes," Sammy replied. "He expected you might call with him before you left the woods, and he is waiting for you at his home." "Oh, good-o," exclaimed Mr. Rabbit. "With any luck, there'll be a spot of lunch he'd like us to help him with." The prospect of the very real possibility of food quite soon helped to take Mr. Rabbit's mind off his burden, and for the first time this morning he began to feel that things weren't so bad after all. Sammy once again wished them the very best, and the two proceeded along the river path to the woods. On the way they came across others, all of whom seemed to be aware that they were heading off on a journey or an important message or something or other that resulted in them receiving quite a bit of attention. In due course they found themselves approaching Owl's home. A door high up in a very wide oak tree lay ajar, proof that Owl was expecting them. They left their packs at the base of the tree and began the upward climb. Mr. Mousey always found it easier than his friend to clamber up trees, but Owl's oak was particularly straightforward. The branches ran round the tree much like a spiral staircase. After a minute or two they had reached the doorway, and Mr. Mousey knocked as Mr. Rabbit breathed in deeply. He broke into a wide grin. "Is that vegetable soup I smell?" "Indeed it is. Come in, came a voice from inside the tree. Mr. Rabbit needed no other invitation, and he was first in, his wide grin becoming one of banana proportions as he saw 3 steaming bowls on the wooden table before him. Now, for being inside the trunk of a tree, Owl's home was surprisingly large. It was built in 2 floors and carved into the walls, where the stairs spiralling up and around the circular room led to rooms above. The room they had entered gave the impression of warmth and coziness. However, being entirely wooden, Owl's house had no fire. but coloured rugs lay upon the floor, and one with a scene with a forest and a castle tower rising through the trees hung on the far wall. Pictures, some of owls and eagles looking serious, dotted the walls. Other pictures showed scenes of places far away. One interesting one had a picture of a magnificent sailing ship with all its sails set, crashing through waves with foam spraying from its bows. Another showed a little stone house nestled in against a rock face with a river running by. Beside it, the cosy inside of a house, perhaps the same one, showed a blazing fire, some furniture and a fireside rug. On the bookcase was a picture of a small dark-haired girl holding the hand of a jolly-looking king. They were smiling at one another, and Mr. Rabbit thought the girl looked a very beautiful child. In the middle of the room were 2 or 3 comfortable soft leather chairs and a couple of stools. The legs of the stools were ornately carved with the shapes of running and leaping animals, mostly deer and foxes, it appeared. Here and there, cleverly cut into the actual tree, were 2 benches and a couple of seats, and between these were 3 curtained windows. The windows looked out onto a sparkling sea of sunlight green, light and shadows mixing in endlessly fascinating patterns and reflecting a warm and cheerful light back into the room, where light chased in constant movement around the floor and on the table. Seated at the table was the owl himself, his wings outstretched in welcome and invitation. "Whatever kept you?" he was saying. "I expected you at least an hour ago. Come on, though, just in time for lunch." It wasn't long until the 3 of them were thoroughly enjoying the soup and bread rolls. Owl had seated the rabbit at the larger of the bowls, and, well, he didn't complain one bit. "So," said the owl, after a bit, when everyone was slowing down enough for a bit of conversation, "what's all this then about a mysterious journey?" Well, that's the end of chapter 3, where they've just begun their journey, and chapter 4, well, you'll need to click on to the next part on the YouTube to find out what's happening next. I hope you enjoyed that, but we'll see what's happening next time. Thanks for listening. Take care. God bless. Bye-bye.